Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Sometimes when you get caught in a rut, you try to find a way that you can think about something else that might make you happy. Perhaps you want to extend your happiness into unlimited amounts of time without having to waste a whole lot of energy. On the Beyond 50 radio program today, we're going to be talking about a new book called The Next 10 Minutes. It's 51 absurdly simple ways to seize the moment. And wouldn't it be a lot better if we could find ourselves there a lot more often? I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author, Dr. Andrew Peterson. Dr. Andrew Peterson, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Now, how did you come to write a book like this where people could learn how to seize the moment in 51 absurd ways?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing. This book really was born out of my own failure to be able to meditate. I'm a real believer in mindfulness meditation, and I'm a psychotherapist, and I teach it to my clients all the time, and I really encourage them to have a meditation practice. And I tend to think of myself as someone who is a meditator. That's why I tell myself that I'm a good meditator. But the truth is, when I actually think about it, is that I don't really do it in a very disciplined way. That question really had been bothering me for a while, and I was trying to figure out what is it that allows me to be present and more mindful in my life, and that question kind of gave rise to a series of other kind of questions that led to these exercises in the book.
Now, one of the exercises you have in your book I found kind of funny because if you actually implemented it, it would almost seem absurd, but then I thought, it really puts you in the moment. That is having your garbage, within your eyesight or at least next to you for at least 10 minutes.
Yes. Yeah, I really like to use sort of the material of everyday life, and I like to use absurdity. I think is kind of an undervalued tool in kind of the arsenal of techniques that we have that our minds can use to make our lives interesting and to kind of bring us more into the present moment. So I really have used a lot of the exercises. They may ask you to do something that you're not really supposed to do, but you're probably going to do anyway, like procrastinate, for instance, or some of these, like with the garbage. I find that absurdity, if we engage our everyday life with a kind of playful sense of absurdity, see it sort of like a child might, that really is one technique that can really help us sort of shed the habitual nature of our actions and become more just in the moment.
Now, as you decided about these 51 ways, how did these come about? How did you decide on the particular ones you feature in your book?
It was a variety of ways. So some of them just kind of came to mind instantly as they're things that I do in my life as I go through my life to kind of make my experience interesting. And oftentimes they're things that I will do with my mind when I'm in a kind of a boring situation. When I'm standing in line at the DMV, it feels like dead time, and there's like nothing in it. That drives me crazy. I can't stand it. And I'm not one of these people who can, call someone on their cell phone or bring up a computer game or something to distract myself. I get kind of bored with that. So I kind of play these little tricks in my mind to like hear, say, for instance, one of the exercises is to hear white noise, to hear all the sounds in your environment as clearly as you can. And it's just a way that so it's a technique that I have used myself. That's one big category of these exercises. Another is are techniques that have evolved in my psychotherapy practice that I use with clients, or they kind of they will sort of evolve spontaneously as I'm working with clients to sort of help them become more mindful. Some of them actually came directly from clients themselves, the things that they came up with.
Now, what were some of the fun ones that other people came up with that you decided to put into your book that our listeners can learn about?
Yeah, well, one of the ones that I feel really happy about is sort of a moment in therapy with a fellow who was he had a really significant trauma in his life. He'd actually been hit by a car as he was crossing the street, and and he was really, it was a kind of a classic sort of PTSD situation where this incident he had all these heavy triggers, and we were working to, so he'd hear the idea of walking down the street would kind of send him into a flashback. And there were a whole bunch of little things that we identified, the food that he'd been eating that morning, and we worked on all of those to kind of desensitize him. But there was one that was particularly difficult for him, and that was the sound of screeching brakes of a car, even way off in the distance. That would just send him into his flashback. And we worked with him, like, what could you do? How could you think about that sound differently so that you could have control of it? And he came up with this idea of, what else has that sound? And he imagined it as a cartoon, as a Roadrunner cartoon. Like he said, what if I put the image of Roadrunner screeching to a stop in my mind whenever I hear that sound? And I said, yeah, that's really cool. And he tried it, and partly it comes back to this absurdity idea. It was so funny to him that it interrupted the flashback. And so I've used that idea with other clients a lot, and I used it as an exercise in the book to just experiment with putting a different visual image and an absurd image to something that might be otherwise upsetting or kind of set you off track.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were putting this book together, did you start discovering, I think sometimes maybe we just take life a little too seriously too often?
Yeah, I tend to think that, and I tend to be that's a problem that I have in my life. I tend to be very much in my head and taking things very seriously. Mm-hmm. So it was actually a real pleasure writing it, because I gave myself permission to be a lot more playful. And I used a lot of another source of these is sometimes my kids. I have two sons, young sons, and they, I just watched them and the way they interact with the world. And I thought, this is so much more fun. It's such a better way to be in the world than we are as adults sometimes. And it's a bit, we can get back to it.
I remember there was a particular place I was working one time, and there was a gal that was my boss, and there was something about, I can't remember what it was I did, and I said, well, I'm just kind of joking. She's like, there's a time for joking and there's a time for not. And I'm thinking, what are you so wrapped up for? This job is not that serious. You're not like NASA or anything like that. Just kind of lighten up. But I guess sometimes people feel the need to be more professional than the time of the day really warrants.
Yeah. I think we all suffer from that to at some degree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, back in the trash thing, it was retrieving an item from the trash. Now, what was the pull for something like that?
The exercise, I'm kind of struggling to get my words here. The exercises are about trying to sort of reinvigorate moments in our everyday life and kind of catch our awareness up in what we're doing. And that just seemed to me to be such an unconscious act that we do it so automatically. And at the same time, I think there's a way in which kind of within the culture and with the sort of other environmental concerns that people have much more in their minds, there's a bit of anxiety about that at the same time, that it's sort of unconscious. People are like, I should be recycling, I should be doing this, there's this kind of, we struggle with our relationship to garbage, I think, which is why I put two exercises in about garbage. One is to actually throw something away intentionally, and the other is to retrieve something from the trash. And so I liked the discomfort that I felt around that. I thought that would be a really good thing to magnify and make it bigger and kind of play with it and see what is our relationship to waste in general, not just garbage. In fact, just sort of the idea that we do produce waste, and I think some of us feel like maybe we shouldn't produce any, and that's kind of impossible. So I like I'm kind of drawn to these contradictions, and kind of I like to blow them up and make them big, and kind of allow ourselves permission to be contradictory people, because we tend to be.
I was going to say, speaking of contradictory, you actually have one of the items in the book to put yourself in paradoxical situations. And I brought that up because as a means to let people know, these aren't just 51 absurdly a lot of these things you think, I wonder what that would really do for me to put me in the moment if I actually did these things. Well, let's talk about that one, for instance.
Yeah, so which were the paradoxical kinds of...
Right.
interventions. Yeah, and that's another one that really comes from therapy a lot. And I'll tell a little story about that from another kind of client story. Because this is it's a technique that is kind of an old venerable therapy technique, which is to kind of put your client, when they're struggling with something, to put them in a paradoxical situation where either way they're going to be successful. A version of that is called prescribing the symptom, where someone feels depressed, you tell them to be more depressed, and it feels kind of crazy. But either way, what you learn from that is that if you don't do it, if you don't try to be more depressed, then you feel better, and that's good. If you try to be more depressed, and like the assignment calls for, then you feel your own control over your own attitude toward your situation. That makes sense. Recently I had a client who was really struggling because he found himself doing things that he didn't want to do. Like his wife was being very demanding of him and asking him to do all these things that she could do for herself. And he said, "I just keep doing them. I don't know why. I don't really want to do them, but I just keep doing them." And the assignment I gave him was a kind of a paradoxical intervention, I guess, to say that, in which I said, just keep doing what you're doing, but what I want you to do is be aware each time this happens, notice it, and say to yourself, I am doing something that I don't want to do. Mm-hmm. And I'm choosing to do something that I don't want to do. Don't go ahead and do it. Just keep doing what you're doing. Don't change your behavior, but just make yourself conscious that you're acting in a contradictory way. Mm-hmm. And he came back the next week. He's like, "Oh man!" He was all sort of energized about this because what happens when you do that sort of paradoxical thing is you step back and observe your own mind in action, and that is what brings us into the present moment. I think is sort of that observing ego, watching our own actions. I think it's very powerful.
I think it's also very true. Anybody who's ever been in the work environment, you tend to hear people who complain, it's either about the boss or the job, or they're not making enough money. It's one thing or another, and it's amazing how many of us actually will go through an 8, a 10, a 12, a 15-hour day with our minds completely preoccupied by, just ruminating thoughts. And you don't realize sometimes that if there was a way, which you mentioned earlier, meditation is one of these ways to clear that mind and be in the moment, that you may not be in the best job on the planet, but it's not as bad as you think it is.
Right. And you have a lot of control in your own mind to be able to make it more interesting. You get to choose how you approach it. And we give away that right, I think. We give it, we act like our boss is in charge of how we feel about what we're doing for our job. But in fact, we get to choose that. We don't get to choose who our boss is and how they act, but we can change our mind about things.
Now, I know one of the items in here I thought was funny because yesterday as I was looking at that, I thought, how would I do this and how would it work? And that is purposely lose something. How do you lose something on purpose? Because you're going to remember where it is, it seems like. Right.
Again, that's kind of that paradoxical thing, and it's sort of playing with the limits of your mind. So there are a number of elements of these exercises which are in fact impossible. Right. You can't do them. One of the exercises is levitate. It's my 9-year-old son's favorite exercise. He loves trying to do that, and you can't do it, but it's about engaging your mind as if it were possible, and just observing how the assumptions that your mind makes. Kind of stretching it out a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And how often has your son been able to levitate?
He's still working on it.
Well, let him know that he can actually do it in the dream world. We actually did a segment a couple of weeks ago on lucid dreaming, and it's amazing what you can actually do in that particular world, and levitation eventually becomes one of those things. But as I remember giving a talk at a university one time about lucid dreaming, I asked people, how many people in here have actually been lucid enough where they could fly, for instance? And I kind of got these interesting looks, and then I think one hand popped up, and I said, now, I have this question to ask you. When you started intentionally trying to do this, what was that like for you? They said, well, I'd find myself kind of like reaching for a rope and pulling myself up, or, wiping your hands like, for instance, you're in a swimming pool. I said, did you ever get to a point where it was like Superman? I said, no, I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm certainly hoping so. And I said, quit trying so hard.
Oh, yeah, nice. yeah, I like that. I don't know much about that, and I guess the word impossible may not quite apply because I don't know what's possible.
No, but I'll tell you, losing something, certainly seems to be an impossible thing when you're doing it on purpose.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I also noticed that in your book that you also pretty much with a good portion of these exercises, you give other references of reading. Now, what made you decide to do that?
Yeah, someone asked me that the other day, and I was trying to draw back to what the origin of that was. What I found was, as I wrote each exercise, I do they give you 5 steps. Here's how you do this, because I find just as a little aside here, that's part of what I find helps bring you into the present moment. Is sort of the exercises that you don't need instructions for, but following instructions, acting as if you needed to follow instructions on how to procrastinate, say, kind of puts you in a more mindful state. So I got that, and I have a little meditation variations on the exercises, and inevitably my mind would kind of go off to sort of broader themes raised by each of these little exercises. And often they would take me to other books and other materials. Mostly it's books, and in a few cases it's music. And I just thought this would be really fun to kind of tie this to. Sometimes they're just oddball books that you would never think about ordinarily. The books on the inner life of appliances for the exercise on read the manual, where have you read a manual for your appliances. I just kept finding all these really fascinating things. I thought this will make it fun. Kind of broaden it out to the world.
Yeah, definitely, that's for sure. Now, one of the things that I liked in the book too, and I'm also going to reflect on a Buddhist precept, which is about giving. And in Buddhism, they suggested that when you give, try to give in such a way that no one knows the source. Just kind of allow that miracle to be in and of itself. And I think a lot of times in a sort of celebrity-driven society, our egos are out there trying to say, look what I've done for somebody else, And so, to me, the giving seems to be rather shallow and insincere because it's about actually finding a way to pat yourself on the back. And I'd like to give an example of how I was able to do this where you get to enjoy it, but that's also the point, too, is that, well, you really shouldn't be in a position where you get an opportunity to enjoy it, but I tell people, why not anyway? And so here I am, I'm at a grocery store, and there's a couple of kids. They're probably about 10, 12 years old, give or take, and they're buying their candy and their soda pop, and they're digging around trying to find their money, and I just simply tell the clerk, I said, here, pay for this, because they were totally distracted in what they were doing. So I said, just be quiet about it, and I was just, as silent as I could be. And so he goes and he pays the whole thing up. The kids turn with the money, and the clerk just simply says, you know what, you're done. Everything's taken care of. And they kind of looked at, and just the looks they had when they were looking at each other, like, what the heck was that all about? But you talk about giving, and that there is a very powerful thing, especially if you can really do it sincerely to sort of add that flavorful mystery to somebody else's life without taking credit for it.
I agree, and actually, in my childhood, that was a big theme. It was a Christian upbringing, but that was something that was told to us a lot. Is that you should be able to give without anyone knowing, and anyone but God, and basically knowing that you have done this and feel good about it. And I struggled with that a lot as a kid, and that is sort of, I think, I hadn't thought about that before. I think that is a little bit of the root of that one, the one exercise, and sort of about giving, where I have you really meditate, sort of try to imagine giving away something that feels essential to your life. It is a very Buddhist kind of concept, letting go of the attachment of things that you identify with so heavily, like your family or your home or something so large, and just kind of sitting with that and really kind of letting go of your own personal investment in it, which I think that's some of what's necessary to be able to give in that sort of delightful way to other people without taking credit for it.
Yeah, very enjoyable stuff. Now, if you can, describe for our listeners what is powerful about being in the present moment.
Wow. I think that's a big question, and I think so many people have been trying to answer that question for hundreds of years. And I think it comes down to it's hard to answer without just going into what the experience of it is. I guess this is something that I really do talk about a lot with my clients as I work with them in therapy, because there's so much of our minds so often are caught up with how do we control things that are in our past or in our present. In all these places where we don't have actual power, we can't control it. And what I feel as being the power of the present moment is literally that sense of power and efficacy that we have. In this moment, I can change how I'm thinking. In this moment, I can change, literally what I'm doing. If I let go of the past and the present and all those things that I can't control, and it's such an enlivening experience, just subjectively. You feel like a bigger person in a certain way, and it's hard to get a grasp on it necessarily. But I think the other piece of it for me that makes it so powerful is that quality of observing our own mind in action. And I'm a big fan of the work of writers like Pan Siegel. If you know him, who writes about sort of the neuroscience and sort of mindfulness. He's been writing a lot about that lately, and about what it means to be in the present moment and to be having an attuned relationship with our own experience. That to me is very, very powerful.
I know that as you were talking earlier, when I brought up the fact that you have books that you recommend reading, in certain chapters for certain things, is out in my garage one day, there was a book that was on basically obsessive thinking, I guess it was, and so I was like, "What's this?" It was just a softcover book that was out there, and I picked it up, and finally I took a look at this, and I have no idea how I even came across the book, but as I was reading, I thought, we obsessively think about things, and the question is, what does that obsession lead us to? And in this book, he was saying, since you're going to obsess about things, why not obsess about things in a very constructive, productive way? So basically, his book is saying, hey, it's a choice. That's what it is. And what was really even more fascinating is in his book, rather than quoting and telling stories about the same, superhumans that we always hear about, whether it's Einstein or Edison, in fact, all of these stories, for the most part, were about people you'd never heard of that obsessed about really marvelous things that you would never think about. For instance, quickly, there was a guy that really loved collecting fonts. That's just what he did. And he got to a point where he was like the expert in the world on fonts, for instance. And you think, it's like the people who tend to collect things, You think to yourself, well, I start to collect something, but then I kind of lose interest. But you see people who actually obsess on collecting things, and you realize what these collections look like, and you go, wow, that's really kind of neat. But those are the kind of things that I think being in the moment help you do, is just to start making those kinds of decisions. And you talk about in your book, sit down and create a list of things that you'd really like to do, or you'd like to have in your life.
Right. What I really like in that story too is that you obsess rather than try to force yourself not to obsess. Just start with accepting who you are and what you do.
Right.
And that's what I've tried to do in a lot of the exercises in this book, and the whole spirit of it is really, just go ahead and do what you're going to do anyway. Just don't fight reality, but do it mindfully. Observe yourself doing it. That's where you have power. And if you really truly do want to change these things, but I give people permission to fail at the things that they are normally going to fail at, and to like meditation, for instance.
Right.
That's the starting point. It's like, I just fail at this. I tend to, and so what do I do? What do I do with that? How can I take a more compassionate view?
Yeah, I think it's funny how most Westerners become romanticized about Eastern philosophy, and they realize, well, it's one thing to sit around and read about this and romanticize about it, but it actually takes work, and meditation is one of those things that sometimes we just don't stick with as often as we should. But, you realize that meditation really has a tremendous benefit because, as you mentioned in your book, these 51 things that you have in here, maybe along with meditation, help you be in the present moment. The power of that is especially today. as we tend to see a lot of films and hear a lot about quantum physics, the power of attraction, and all this, is that when you can be in that moment, you literally, in a particular moment, have a multitude of choices. And that's the powerful point about it. And I think, was that kind of one of your goals to be able to get people to open up to?
Yeah, absolutely. That fits perfectly. That I could have written those words, I think, and that would have fit perfectly in the book. I like that.
Now, could you tell us if there's a website people can find out more about this?
Absolutely, yes. And the book went on sale yesterday. It was just born. And I have my website, which is The Next 10 Minutes, www.thenext10minutes.com. And you can links to other things there in the book, where to buy the book. That sort of thing.
It's been a pleasure to be in this infinite particular moment with you today.
Absolutely. Likewise. It's been a good several 10 minutes here.
The book is The Next 10 Minutes, 51 Ways That You Can Actually Be in the Present Moment, and our guest today, Dr. Andrew Peterson. Dr. Peterson, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. We also encourage you, while you're in this present moment, to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. Visit us on our blog. We'll archive this particular show and have great resource information for you to follow through and be in a present moment for yourself. We thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.